The book I'm going to talk about today is called The Biology of Desire by Marc David Lewis. Now, bear with me because I think there's a very important lesson for people to take to heart on self-control, which is, I think, what most people deal with on some level, right? So bear with me. I'm going to go through the book though. His idea is to say that the disease model of addiction is not the best one. Maybe even it's wrong, because while the disease model has utility because it reduces the stigma against addicts and maybe it makes for good marketing for rehab centers, also gives money to research programs around addiction because they can apply to the medical boards or whatever. So there's utility to the disease model and explains a lot. There are problems though, which he points out in the book. For example, it might lower an addict's sense of self-efficacy, which is crucial to get better, right? He cannot just see himself as almost irreparably damaged, right? That's just one of the problems he goes into. I won't go through all of them because that's not really my focus in this video. But so let's look at what addiction really is. What's a good model to capture it? In this book, Marc David Lewis points to addiction as being a very powerful habit, okay? And what differentiates it from other more benign habits are three things. One is that it's a habit of thought and feeling, not just a behavioral habit, right? So it's harder to fix. Um, Desire plays a crucial role in these habits, which makes a really powerful learning. Like once you put desire in, you get really powerful learning. Okay, and the third thing is because desire plays a part in these habits, they are more compulsive than regular habits. Okay, so and to understand how this habit forming works, we have to think of the brain as a self-organizing model. Okay, so there's limited pre-coding, let's just call it that, and it uses feedback mechanisms to grow itself, right? So you think about craving a cheesecake, okay? Maybe you have that cheesecake and you enjoy it. Now your brain is going to make the necessary changes within it to make it more likely that you'll have that cheesecake again in the future, right? And what fires together wires together. Let's remember this, okay? And what fires apart wires apart. So this explains kind of the narrowing of attention in addiction too, because certain goals will kind of rise up in the hierarchy and take prominence, and other goals will fall behind because uh, synapses, whatever, that aren't being used, from disuse, they actually, you get dissolution, okay? So anyways, coming back to this cheesecake example, your synapses will form, whatever, you have that cheesecake again, and then it gets more powerful, the wiring in your brains, to make it more likely that outcome happens, and then more and more that feedback mechanism repeats itself, and pretty soon all you want is that cheesecake. It makes for really powerful craving, right? And now when you look at learning, what makes for powerful learning, you have three things basically. You have repetition is the engine of learning, right? The more you repeat something, the more you're going to form the synapses uh, to learn that thing. There's attention, right? Like when you're motivated, you're focused, you learn a lot better. And you have emotion. Like if it's an emotion laden experience, you're going to learn from it a lot more, okay? Now you look at addictions. You have all three coming in. You have the repetition, you have the attention that's hijacked because you have such powerful desire behind these things. And of course, if these things were boring, like if cocaine was boring, if porn was boring, you wouldn't get addicted to these things. But there's so much desire packed in that it makes for really powerful learning that your brain learns that this is a place I can go to get a reward, right? Okay. So how do you now, there are two psychological mechanisms that make addiction particularly hard to beat. Okay, one is called delay discounting, or we can call it now appeal, and the other one is ego fatigue. Okay, ego fatigue is where that really crucial lesson of self-control is, I believe. So I'll come to it after this one. Delay discounting has a evolutionary utility, so it makes us go after low-lying fruit. Okay, so let's say you're sitting at a table in a restaurant. This is an example from the book, and a girl in a red dress or something waves at you. Now, that would be the low-lying fruit, okay? Um, that's an immediate reward you can have in your environment rather than waiting until you get home to your wife, okay? Now, of course, there's an evolutionary utility because getting these immediate rewards is going to help you survive, okay? So, and I've heard this discussed in other books too. Dopamine has this thing built in where immediate rewards are valued more than future rewards. Okay, so that's a very powerful mechanism, and it gets kind of enhanced as ego fatigue happens. So let's go into that. Ego fatigue, there's a very famous study by Baumeister, it's called like a cookie study, where when participants come into the lab, those who try to not eat the cookie, they actually perform on the cognitive task that happens after for less of a duration. Okay, so uh, this might make you think that self-control is a resource that can be depleted. This is actually not a correct explanation, and I won't go into the nuances because I actually don't even know them. Just keep in mind that ego fatigue is a thing, or you can also call it self-control depletion. So in addiction, what happens is you have kind of the motivational core of the brain, which is has an older vintage than the more recently developed parts of the brain, which would be the frontal cortex, for example, right? Now, in addiction, because you're chasing these immediate goals and stuff, and you have the same goals you're going after, the DLPFC, which is a very advanced brain region in the frontal cortex, it kind of gets disconnected from that motivational core. Okay, the motivational core, you guys don't need to know this, but it would be the striatum, ventral striatum. You'd have the orbital frontal cortex, which is kind of at the floor of the more advanced region, and you have the amygdala, which is where the feeling or the emotions part of the brain. Okay, so and if you think about it, the brain is supposed to connect cognition to feelings or emotions, so it's very natural. Okay, so when you exert self-control in addiction, it's a very childish kind that comes from thinking like, I won't do this. Okay, and that's because the higher brain region, the LPFC, which actually you can think of it as having good software built into it to control ourselves, which is supposed to counter the more immediate wanting that's self-destructive, that's kind of become decoupled from the striatum, the lower part of the brain. The striatum is where you connect actions to goals. Okay, so in ego fatigue, we see this in labs. Let's say that DLPFC becomes disconnected from the striatum. You see it in now appeal that I talked about. You see it in a whole bunch of things like even OCD, see it in eating disorders, whatever. So these are lessons that you can take into other areas of your life, okay? And like we talked about in the study, like those who practice self-control earlier with the cookie, um, they weren't able to do it in the following task. Okay, so what does that tell us? It's that suppression doesn't really work, okay? It's not a good self-control strategy. So when an addict, let's say, makes a choice, actually choice is a loaded word. Let's say they finally are able to quit the addiction. It's not that suddenly they got a lot of self-control. It's just that the character of the self-control changed. It went from a childish, I won't do this, to something else, which I'm going to cover later in the video, which I think is a really powerful lesson. Okay. And just one other thing I want to point out here is there is a phase in addiction where for it to become a full-blown addiction, it goes from being impulsive to being compulsive. And we can see this in the brain where it's from the ventral part of the striatum, where I said actions are coupled to goals, it goes into a more dorsal part where now you see a stimuli or a cue, and you get like a wave of excitement, you get emotions, anxiety, whatever. So that makes for really powerful uh, habits. And even more, just becomes compulsive after a certain point where it's not even about the reward anymore, but it's just about doing it. It's just an action. So it's like you see a cigarette and you want to smoke, or like in CBT, they try and make you identify all these triggers. So let's say you see a cheesecake in the kitchen, and now you need to have it, right? That's the point in the addiction where it's become a compulsion, and that reflects the change. And of course, the fuel for all this is dopamine, right? So the dopamine is generated in the midbrain. We actually talked about dopamine in another video I did on the Molecule of More book. Anyways, so it emerges there, and then it kind of goes into the striatum, and that's the fuel to get you going. And the dopamine stops going to the DLPFC like we talked about, so you're not using your higher level processes as much, and in the compulsive phase of addiction, it's going to that dorsal part of the striatum, where now it's just compulsive. You see the stimuli, you see the cue, and you just perform, like without even thinking about the rewards, right? So how do we beat addiction then? And this is, I think, the most powerful lesson of this video. I hope you guys stuck around so far. So there was a famous study, or not famous, there was a nice study done at UBC where they looked at native communities and suicide rates, okay? there were some communities with 500 to 800% times the national average for suicide rates. Okay, and then there were other communities though that had 0%. Okay, which is a crazy difference. And they saw what is the difference here between these communities, and what they picked out was the stories these kids told. Uh, okay, so and what happened was that these structures in certain native communities would kind of hold together that continuity of self for these kids and give them stories that tied their past to their future. And this is the key lesson. So you can't really recover from addiction, like most people think. Like recovery is a bad word, okay? Because it makes you think that you're just repairing the brain or something. But what addicts are actually doing is they're growing from their experiences, okay? What they're doing is they're realigning the desire. So you can't just like take a cheesecake and then stop. Just try and make yourself stop desiring it. I mean, maybe there's some ways like associating it with something disgusting or something. I don't know, but that's not how we go about it. Okay, the right way is to realign the desire with a better goal, a higher goal. Okay, this is the key. So, like we talked about, the DLPFC has been disconnected from the striatum, and like I said, what fires together wires together. So you need to recouple them. And how do you do that? Well, you show someone that there is something in the future worth striving for, and you cultivate the desire to get there. Okay? So now appeal is like the book says, it's like a gorge that a gorge between a meaningless past and a kind of a unimagined future. Okay? When you don't have that meaningful past or that imagined future, you get stuck in the eternal present where you're just trying to gratify yourself immediately in the present, okay? So you just get stuck in this now appeal. You're just chasing after low-lying fruit. You get stuck in addictions, for example. So what you want to do is give that person a narrative where it feels like their past makes sense and it continues into the future with viable goals, satisfying, attainable, meaningful, personally derived goals. And if you look at a lot of therapeutic settings, the participants are kind of sitting there passive. They're hating the therapy. The staff are often disinterested. So these are all the wrong conditions to foster this kind of narrative, right? You and other people's goals will not get that desire, will not realign that desire as much as personally derived goals, okay? So that's why I've watched a lot of, like I've read some addiction literature, and often one of the themes is that they're chasing after goals that come from outside and they're not personally meaningful. But then these addicts sometimes find a personally meaningful goal. Like let's say they'll become therapists themselves or something. They'll try to help other people. And that's a personally derived goal that actually has desire tied to it, okay? And this requires training because in the heat of the moment when you're craving something, like a cigarette or something, you need to practice and get that neuroplasticity going so that the dopamine doesn't just hit that striatum, but also gets into that DLPFC, the higher brain region, okay? And like I talked about in the other video I did on the molecule of more, it was also on dopamine. I talked about how there are two streams of dopamine, right? There's a mesolimbic pathway, and there's a mesocortical pathway to the frontal cortex, okay? The brain, what it does is it uses these two pathways to kind of challenge each other and keep itself in check, okay? Like I talked about in the other video, if you just wanted to go buy a car, you just go buy the first car you see, but that's not what you do. The desire also makes you plan stuff out, go and research other cars on the market, and then that's how the frontal cortex keeps the mesolimbic pathway in check, okay? So if you're trying to recover from an addiction, trying to control yourself, whatever, don't use childish strategies like suppression where you just say, I won't do this, because then what you're doing is you're cultivating anxiety, and that anxiety will build and build because the only way it gets assuaged is by doing that forbidden act, okay? And you're just going to keep building the anxiety until you do it. So it's not that addicts don't use self-control. If anything, they use more self-control than other people. It's the wrong sort. It has the wrong character. The self-control that works is kind of reinterpretation, reappraisals, realigning the desire with something, a more worthwhile goal in the future, stuff like this, okay? And just the last thing, one thing I can talk about is the reduction in gray matter. So like I said, from disuse, your certain synapses, pathways will fade away, and you can see this reflected in reduction of gray matter in addicts. The positive thing is that the gray matter comes back 6 months to a year of abstinence later, and the gray matter returns to baseline, and sometimes it actually even grows past baseline. So it's almost as if the addicts are have stronger self-regulation than regular people. They grow even more gray matter in those brain regions. Okay, so just key thing to take away from this video: if you're dealing with binge eating, um, you're trying to lose weight, whatever it is, suppression does not work. It leads to ego fatigue. It decouples the DLPFC from the striatum stuff. Okay, the motivational core in the brain. What does work is reinterpretations, reappraisals, connecting yourself to a envisioned future that's worthwhile for you, that realigns the desire for you towards that goal. Okay, without that meaningful past connected to the imagined future, you get stuck in that endless gorge. Some people never even make it out of this gorge of the now appeal, where they're just chasing after low-lying fruit. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.